Otis Redding wrote Respect in 45 minutes, sitting on the floor of a recording studio in Memphis, Tennessee. And the moment he finished, he knew it was the most powerful song he had ever created. What he did not know was that a woman in New York City was about to take that song, tear it apart, rebuild it from the ground up, and turn it into something so explosive that the entire world would forget Otis ever wrote it in the first place. It was the spring of 1965, and Otis Redding was 23 years old, sitting cross-legged on the cold linoleum floor of Stax Records on East Macklemore Avenue in Memphis, Tennessee. The building had been a movie theater once, a place where black families sat in the balcony because the seats on the ground floor were reserved for white audiences. Now it was something else entirely. Now it was a place where black musicians made music that shook the walls and rattled the windows and made the whole neighborhood stop and listen. Otis had a notepad on his knee and a pencil behind his ear, and he was writing fast, the way he always wrote when something was coming through him that felt bigger than himself. He was not composing. He was not crafting. He was receiving, the way a lightning rod receives electricity from the sky, helpless and grateful, and a little bit terrified by the power of what was passing through him. The song was about a man coming home. A working man, a man who had been out on the road for weeks, grinding, hustling, doing whatever it took to bring money back to the woman he loved. And all he was asking for, the only thing he wanted after all of that sacrifice, was a little respect when he walked through that front door. Just a little. Just enough to remind him that what he did mattered. That he mattered. The word itself, respect, sat in the center of the song like a heartbeat. Simple, direct, devastating. Otis sang the first verse out loud to himself, right there on that floor, and when he hit the chorus, his voice cracked open the way it always did when he was onto something real, and he knew. He knew before he even stood up. He knew before he walked into the studio and told guitarist Steve Cropper that he had something. He knew before the band ran through it the first time, and the whole room went electric with the feeling that something important had just entered the world. They recorded Respect that same afternoon. The session was tight and focused, the way Stax sessions always were, because nobody at Stax Records had time to waste. Jim Stewart and his sister Estelle Axton had built that studio from almost nothing, scraping together equipment and talent and sheer determination in a city that was still deeply divided along racial lines. The musicians who recorded there, black and white alike, understood that what they were making was not just music. It was a statement. Every song that came out of that building was proof that something extraordinary could happen when people set aside the ugliness of the world outside and focused entirely on the sound. And Respect was one of the most extraordinary things that had ever come out of that building. Otis released the song in the summer of 1965 on the Volt label, which was a subsidiary of Stax. It climbed the rhythm and blues charts and reached number 4. For a 23-year-old kid from the sharecropping fields of Dawson, Georgia, who had dropped out of school at 15 to dig wells and pump gas and keep his family from starving, reaching number 4 on the rhythm and blues charts was not just a success. It was a miracle. It was proof that everything he had believed about himself since he was a boy standing on a wooden crate in a Vineville Baptist church choir, singing gospel until the old women closed their eyes and grabbed each other's hands. All of it was true. He had something. He had always had something. And now the world was starting to understand what that something was. But Respect did not cross over to the mainstream pop charts in the way Otis had hoped. The wall between rhythm and blues radio and pop radio in 1965 was thick and stubborn and enforced by a music industry that had decided, consciously or not, that certain music belonged to certain audiences and those audiences should not mix. Otis was selling out theaters in Harlem and Atlanta and Memphis. But white teenagers in the suburbs had mostly never heard his name. That fact burned in him quietly, a slow fire that never went out, because Otis Redding did not make music for one audience. He made music for human beings. He believed that if you put enough truth into a song, enough raw and unguarded honesty, it would reach anyone. It would reach everyone. He just needed the right moment. He just needed someone to open a door. What happened next was not what he expected. The door did not open for him. It opened for someone else. And that someone else walked through it carrying his song. Aretha Louise Franklin was 24 years old in 1967, the daughter of the Reverend Clarence LaVaughn Franklin, one of the most powerful and celebrated Baptist preachers in America. She had grown up in Detroit, Michigan, in a house where gospel music was as essential as food and air, where figures like Mahalia Jackson and Clara Ward came to Sunday dinner, and the piano was never silent for long. She had been signed to Columbia Records at 18, and Columbia had spent 6 years trying to figure out what to do with her, dressing her up in strings and orchestras and pop arrangements that were sophisticated and tasteful and almost completely wrong for a voice like hers. Aretha Franklin's voice was not a voice that needed sophistication. It was a voice that needed truth. It needed rawness. It needed the freedom to scream and whisper and beg and demand within the space of a single breath. In 1966, Jerry Wexler at Atlantic Records signed Aretha away from Columbia and took her to Fame Studios in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, where he sat her down at the piano and told her to play what she felt. What came out of those sessions was something that nobody in the music industry had ever quite heard before. Aretha Franklin playing piano and singing simultaneously was like watching a thunderstorm happen inside a cathedral. She was not performing. She was not executing a producer's vision. She was expressing something so deep and so personal and so universal that it seemed to bypass the ears entirely and go straight to the chest. And it was in the middle of this creative explosion that Jerry Wexler played her Otis Redding's recording of Respect. He had been listening to it for 2 years. He thought it was extraordinary. He thought Aretha could do something with it. He had no idea what she was going to do with it. Nobody did. What Aretha Franklin did to Respect in the winter of 1967 was not a cover. A cover implies imitation. What Aretha did was transformation. She took the song that Otis had written from the perspective of a working man asking his woman to honor what he brought home, and she turned it inside out completely. In her hands, in her voice, Respect became something else. It became a declaration. It became a demand. It became an anthem for every woman who had ever been told to be quiet, to be grateful, to be smaller than she was. It became an anthem for every Black American who had been told to accept less than they deserved. Aretha did not just change the gender of the narrator. She changed the entire emotional architecture of the song. She added the legendary spelling out of the word respect, R-E-S-B-E-C-T, which her sister Carolyn suggested during the recording session. She added the Sock It To Me chorus. She added layers of gospel fire and feminine fury that Otis had never imagined when he was sitting on that floor in Memphis with his notepad and his pencil. The recording session took place in January of 1967 at Atlantic Studios in New York City. It lasted only a few hours. When it was done, Jerry Wexler walked out of the studio and told anyone who would listen that he had just witnessed history. He was not wrong. Aretha Franklin's Respect was released in April of 1967, and within weeks, it had done something that Otis Redding's original had never managed to do. It crossed over. It crossed every line that the music industry had drawn, the line between rhythm and blues and pop, the line between Black audiences and white audiences, the line between music as entertainment and music as a political statement. It went to #1 on both the rhythm and blues charts and the Billboard Hot 100 simultaneously. It stayed there for weeks. It became the soundtrack of the summer of 1967, which was one of the most turbulent and transformative summers in American history. A summer of civil rights marches and urban uprisings, and a generation of young people demanding that the country live up to the promises it had made. When Otis Redding heard Aretha Franklin's version of Respect for the first time, he was sitting in the back of a tour bus somewhere in the American South. His road manager, a man named Earl Speedo Sims, was watching him carefully, not sure what to expect. Otis listened to the whole thing without saying a word. When it was over, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he smiled. It was not a small or polite smile. It was a real, full, genuine smile, the kind that reached all the way up to his eyes. He shook his head slowly, the way a man does when he has just witnessed something that surprises him, even though part of him always knew it was coming. And then he said the words that everyone who was in that bus that day remembered for the rest of their lives. "That girl took my song. There was no bitterness in his voice when he said it. That is the thing that everyone who tells this story always makes sure to say. There was no anger, no resentment, no wounded pride. What there was in his voice was something closer to wonder. He had written a song about needing to be seen, and a woman he had never met had taken that song and used it to make sure that an entire generation of people who had never been seen were finally, undeniably, impossible to ignore. He had written about his own hunger, and she had turned it into everyone's hunger. That is not theft. That is transformation. That is what music does when it is truly alive. It moves from one person to another and becomes something new each time without losing the truth at its center. Otis Redding was 25 years old in the summer of 1967 when Aretha Franklin's Respect was at #1 on the charts. He was 25 years old, and he had already written a song that had changed the world twice. Once when he wrote it, and once when someone else sang it. He would never be 26. He would never hear the full arc of what that song became. How it grew from an anthem into an institution. How it was played at marches and memorials and celebrations and graduations. How it was used to demand justice and mourn loss and welcome new life. He would never know that decades after his death, people would still argue about which version was better, his raw and aching original or Aretha's volcanic reinvention, as if that argument itself was a kind of tribute to the song's inexhaustible power. What he knew in the summer of 1967, sitting on that tour bus with a smile on his face and the sound of Aretha's voice still echoing in the air around him, was that something he had made in 45 minutes on a cold studio floor in Memphis had found its way out into the world and become larger than himself. That is what every artist hopes for. That is what very few artists ever get. Otis Redding got it at 23 years old and spent the rest of his short life trying to understand what it meant and trying to make something else that felt as true and as necessary and as alive. He recorded sitting on the dock of the bay 3 days before he died. He whistled the ending because he had not yet written the final verse, and he planned to come back and finish it later. He never came back, but the song went to #1 anyway. And that whistle, that small, soft, unfinished sound, became one of the most recognizable moments in the history of recorded music. An accident, a placeholder, a goodbye that nobody recognized until it was too late. But before the dock, and before the lake, and before the silence that followed, there was respect. There was a 23-year-old man on a cold floor in Memphis, riding as fast as he could, trying to catch something that was passing through him before it disappeared. He caught it. He held on to it long enough to give it to the world, and the world took it and ran. Some songs belong to the person who wrote them. Some songs belong to the person who sang them loudest. And some songs belong to everyone who ever needed them. Everyone who ever stood in a room and felt invisible. Everyone who ever worked until their hands were raw and came home to silence. Everyone who ever needed someone to look them in the eye and say that what they gave mattered. Respect belongs to all of those people. It always did. Otis Redding knew that when he wrote it on that cold studio floor in Memphis. He just did not know yet how many people were waiting for it. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the things we create can outlive us and grow beyond anything we ever imagined, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this one. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their work matters, that their voice matters, that the things they pour their heart into can change the world in ways they will never fully see. And leave a comment below telling us which version of Respect hits you harder, the raw and aching original that Otis wrote on that floor in Memphis, or the volcanic declaration that Aretha turned it into. We want to know.